Hey everyone, Will Musk here. Welcome to Spread Ideas, the channel where we're all about exploring the coolest tech, sharing inspiring lifestyle tips, and diving into the world of digital entrepreneurship. Get ready for a wild ride. The video presents an inspiring view on the importance of thinking big and daring to achieve innovative results. The practical tips for adopting 10x thinking are valuable for any product management professional. The video introduces the concept of 10x thinking in the context of product management. The speaker, Ken Norton, argues that companies need to think in terms of 10x, not 10%, to achieve truly innovative results. Tips for adopting 10x thinking in product management are presented. 1. Add zeros to the impact, not the effort. Seek solutions that multiply the product's impact by 10, not just improve it by 10%. 2. Bet on trends. Identifying and investing in emerging trends can give the company a significant advantage. 3. Sequence the genome. Break down complex problems into smaller, more manageable parts. 4. Ask, how do we get to 1 billion users? This question stimulates creative thinking and the search for innovative solutions. Key points to highlight in your video. 1. The story of Kodak as an example of how a lack of adaptation can lead to failure. 2. The importance of thinking in terms of 10x to achieve innovative results. 3. The practical tips for adopting 10x thinking in product management. 4. The relevance of 10x thinking for the success of companies in today's market. I highly recommend this talk to anyone who works with products, from managers to designers. It's a dose of reality and inspiration.
This is an artifact. It's a fossil from the 20th century. This is a film camera. This one is actually the Brownie Flash 4, which was made here in England. So it's another rich layer in England's archaeological history. This one from the 20th century, this one was made in 1957, again here in England, by Kodak. Kodak sold millions of Brownie cameras over about an 85-year period. This was film. The yellow thing on the right. The other thing is a film canister, which is probably one of the greatest inventions ever made, one of the most useful things. That's a story for another day. This was film. At one point, the world was buying billions of rolls of film a year. Kodak enjoyed an 80% profit margin on film. They dominated the market. For years, Kodak was there recording our lives. It's been said that Kodak was the Google of its day. Since they were founded in 1888, they were known for their innovation. At one point, they had 60,000 employees, which is about how many employees Google has today. So as an employee of Google, this makes me think. From circuit boards to Hollywood movies to the space program, Kodak was there. To give you a sense of just how dominant Kodak was, this is the film camera market. At the start of this graph, on the left, in 1976, Kodak already had 90% of the film and 85% of the camera sales in the US. So completely dominant. But we all know why the right side of that graph is black. Something happened. By 2012, revenue had plummeted. The company would file for bankruptcy, and Kodak was essentially reduced to a pile of patents. 50,000 of those jobs would be lost, most of those in New York, Western New York, near where I grew up. So what happened? Well, in order to tell you what happened, I'm going to need to scrunch the graph here a little bit. We all know what happened. Digital cameras happened. Now, Kodak had made transitions before. They'd gone from dry plate to film. They'd gone from black and white to color. So this was a company that knew how to seize technological trends. So what happened? Well, before I move on, I want to share with you that this, of course, isn't even the end of the story. These digital cameras would prove to be very short-lived. Because along come smartphones. This slide is supposed to make you dizzy. I didn't realize how dizzy it was going to make me standing below it. 1.5 billion smartphones will be sold this year. That's essentially 1.5 billion pocket cameras. I mean, think about how many cameras are in this room right now compared to how many would have been here 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. That's 40 times the number of film cameras that were sold in the very best year. Smartphones, 40 times the number. Around the world, we're going to take 1 trillion photos this year. You get a sense of how big 1 trillion is. That's 2.7 billion photos a day. More than 80% of those are being taken on their phones. So what happened to Kodak? Were they maybe not innovative enough? Did they not get that digital was going to dominate film? Not really. This is the very first digital camera ever made. It was in 1975. It used a cassette recorder for storage. For many of you millennials, the cassette will probably look as antiquated as the film did. They were selling digital cameras to consumers as early as 1991. So this is a company that not only got digital, they effectively invented it. So this wasn't a company that was taken by surprise. This is Steven Sasson. He's the engineer at Kodak who invented the digital camera. He says that when he first gave a demo to some executives at Kodak, they said, one of them took him aside and said, "That's really cute, but don't tell anybody about it." And as Steven says, they essentially couldn't get permission to ship it in the early days. Because every digital camera that would be sold took away from a film camera. And Kodak knew how much money they made on film. And they knew how much money they made on film cameras. And they just didn't want to invest. As late as 2006, Kodak's CEO called digital a crappy business. I mean, that's 2006. That's not very long ago. So what happened with Kodak is, it's not that they didn't see the future. In fact, their engineers essentially invented it. It's their managers squandered it because they cared more about getting another 10% in the film industry than they cared about building something big for the future. And that shouldn't surprise us. We all have that essential preservation instinct. It's called loss aversion. It means that losing hurts more than winning feels good. Psychologists say essentially it's about 2 to 1. So losing $100 hurts as much as winning $200 feels good. It's why we hold on to stocks as they kind of go down, hoping that they're going to recover. It's why we keep betting at the casino, figuring we're going to win back our money. So companies have loss aversion. That shouldn't surprise us. Companies are made up of people. I want to do a little exercise to prove this point. I want you to imagine at your company, you have a choice between 2 projects. For the sake of argument, we're going to pretend that these projects are both equal in terms of the number of people who are going to work on them, the dollars you want to spend, whatever it is. One of these projects you think will give you a 99% chance at an additional $1 million in revenue. 99%, almost certain. There's always a chance, but it feels pretty likely. The other one will give you a 1% chance at $1 billion. Now, which do you think your company would choose? I mean, I think I know the answer for most of us. I mean, pick the sure bet, right? Why take that risk, putting all these people, all this time, all this money into something with a tiny, tiny payoff? Take the sure bet, $1 million bucks, that sounds great. But through decision science, we know actually the expected value of that $1 billion is 10 times as much, right? So even logic tells us we should take that 1% billion dollar bet. But our brains don't work like that, and our companies don't work like that. Now, I completely made this up, and rarely are things so cut and dry. I mean, obviously, as product managers, you don't know there's a 99% chance or 1%. That almost proves the point even more, right? Even when it is this cut and dry, we often can't pick the big bet. So much of our corporate culture, so much of the way we talk about running organizations is built around preserving the downside, avoiding mistakes, avoiding errors, under-promise and over-deliver. Slow and steady wins the race. I mean, the fact that we so many times just continuously chase our competition. Now, the problem is that Kodak, in this example, they were a 10% company, and they needed to be a 10x company. 10x, 10 times, an order of magnitude. It's a moonshot. At Google, we call 10x moonshots. If you're only aiming for 10%, you're taking the obvious path that everyone else is on. You know, Kodak continuing to grow the film market. That was an obvious, they knew how that was going to go. But if you aim for 10x, you have to think completely different about the problem. If you want to build a car that gets 50 miles to the gallon, you kind of know how to do that, right? But if you want to build a car that gets 500 miles to the gallon, you have to completely throw out everything you think about making cars. You have to think about the problem completely differently, because there's no possible way you'll get 10x doing the same thing you did before. So imagine when Steve demoed that digital camera in the 70s, if Kodak had said, what would it take to get people to take 1 trillion photos a year? Right? It was obvious it wasn't going to be sell more film. I mean, where would we even put the film, let alone the prints? And I mean, that's ridiculous. It's clear the answer would have had to come from somewhere else. There's all sorts of these 10x examples in history. Take watches. So for many, many years, watchmakers, mechanical watchmakers, competed with each other to make more and more accurate watches. Every now and then there'd be a little leap. I think Zenith at one point went from 28,800 movements a second to 36,000 or something like that. And that was like a 25% improvement. That was huge. But most of the time it was pretty much a slog. You're trying to make parts smaller. You're trying to machine them more accurately. It was delicate. It was exhausting work. It required tremendous craftsmanship. And all your competitors were doing the same thing. But how would you make a watch that was 10 times more accurate? It's pretty clear that you wouldn't make a 10 times more accurate watch by just making the parts smaller and smaller and smaller. You do it like this. That's a hell of a lot uglier than the last photo I showed you. But this watch is 10 times more accurate than the best mechanical watch. This is the very first quartz movement watch that was ever introduced by Seiko. It's called the Seiko Astron. 10 times more accurate. And even better, quartz watches were 10% the cost. So it's why, even today you can buy a $10 Casio watch, and it's more accurate than a $10,000 Rolex. Mechanical watches are great. I have one on my wrist. I'm not trying to diss mechanical watches. But you don't buy a mechanical watch because you need to know what time it is. It's a completely different product. So 90% of the watches today sold are quartz watches, right? This completely changed the industry. And after you heard the story about Steve Sasson at Kodak, you probably won't be surprised to find out that it was actually a Swiss watchmaker who invented the quartz watch, who was really the first one to bring quartz movement to watches. Swiss watchmakers, they were a little afraid. They didn't want to invest in that. They were afraid, what does this mean for our mechanical watch business? Astro Teller, who I work with at Google, he's the head of Google X. The only thing cooler than Astro's name is his title, which is Captain of Moonshots. He says, sometimes it's easier to make something 10x better than it is to make it 10% better. So think about that quartz movement. That was a lot of work to get that Seiko watch out. That was a lot of work to miniaturize it, to get the quartz movement. But was it harder than getting another 10% from mechanical watches? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it was easier, actually. Because when you're doing 10%, you're using existing tools, existing assumptions, all the stuff that everybody spent time thinking about, extra efforts, resources, money. It's usually 10% the cost, 10% more people, 10% more time. But when you're aiming for 10x, you have to lean instead on bravery and creativity and completely new ideas. This is the kind of thing that literally put a man on the moon. 10x, not 10%. So I think at this point you're probably thinking, you work at Google, sounds great. I don't work at Google or SpaceX. Sounds fine to throw all this time and money and energy into these 1% payoffs. But the interesting thing you find is when I talk to small companies, I talk to startups, they say, that sounds great for big companies like Google. You got a lot of money, you got a lot of people. What's the worst that can happen? You fail, but you have an existing business to fall back on. But then you talk to big companies, and they say, that sounds great for a startup. Like, what do you have to lose? The company's going to go out of business. You don't have customers. You don't have revenue to sacrifice. And what I want to do today is convince you that 10x is just a way of thinking about building products. And it has nothing to do with whether you're Google or you're SpaceX or you work for the government or you work for the railroad industry. 10x is a way to think about solving problems. The first thing you need to recognize when you think about 10x is that failure has to be an option. Astro uses the example of an explorer. Imagine that a team of explorers sends a bunch of scouts out and says, see if you can find a mountain. Let's say the scouts come back a few weeks later, they didn't find a mountain. If you shame them, like if you punish those scouts, you fire them, they're not going to go look for any mountains again, right? They're not going to take those kinds of chances. But the interesting thing that happens when you fail is that you learn something new. And learning is knowledge. So if you fail trying something ambitious, chances are maybe you've succeeded doing something pretty amazing. Like maybe you didn't find the mountain, but you found a water source or you found a village. So when you try and fail and you're trying something ambitious, sometimes amazing things can happen. But most of all, trying requires failure, and failure is learning. I'm going to give you an example from the arts. Two artists named Ted Orland and David Whalen, they wrote a book about art where they tell a story about a ceramics teacher. And this ceramics teacher somehow found herself with a class split in two. So maybe one half of the class met one day a week, the other half of the class met another day a week. So this is a PM audience. She said, I'm going to do an A/B experiment. She divided the class into two sections. The first half of the class, she said the same thing to them that she'd been saying to students for 20 years. Your grade is going to be based on the quality of your work. At the end of the semester, turn in the single best piece you made, and you're going to get a grade on it. The better the technical work, the higher the quality, the better the grade you can get. Simple, right? But the other half of the class, she said something very different to. She said, your job this semester is to crank out as many pots as you can. Just crank them out. And those of you who, over the course of the semester, make 100 pots, you're going to get an A. If you only make 50, you're going to get a B, and so on. So really, quantity. And according to the story, she found something interesting at the end of the semester. And that was that the very best work, so when she assessed the quality of the work, the pots that had the highest technical work, the best artistic sophistication, came not from the group of the class that she encouraged to aim for quality, but from the quantity group. By cranking out pot after pot after pot, they were learning, they were getting better, they were making better work, even though they didn't even set out for that. Even though most of the students probably didn't care, they just wanted to make 100 pots and be done. But the work that they were creating was better. And as Bales and Orland put it, what you need to know about the next piece is contained in the last piece. So the more last pieces there are, the more trials, the more failures, the more you learn, and the better you get. So we don't build quality by striving and aiming for perfection, but by trying and learning. 10x, not 10%. So how do you build a company that thinks that way? How do you build a team that thinks that way? First thing you recognize is the people who work for you, who work with you, they want to do great work. They're professionals. You hired them because they're great at what they do. And that when they make mistakes, they're the result of good intentions. They tried and they failed. And that they can learn from those mistakes and they can do better. Now, this sounds like a platitude, and I see a lot of heads nodding, but a lot of companies don't really run that way. They don't base it on that assumption. In the 60s, an MIT psychologist named Douglas McGregor proposed a management theory he called Theory X versus Theory Y. Theory X was the traditional way of management leading up into the 60s that goes back for generations, and that is workers are lazy, they want to avoid work, all they want to do is cut out early, they have no ambition, they resist change, and your job as a manager is to crack the whip and force them to do their jobs. If anybody's ever worked in retail or restaurants when they were a teenager, you've experienced Theory X managers. The Theory Y was the opposite. At the time, it was much more innovative. It doesn't sound as innovative now. And that's that people want to do great work. And that work is as natural to us as play. We've got imagination, we've got creativity, we want to do awesome things. And that your job as a Theory Y manager is to get the hell out of the way and let people do great things. And give them the support and give them the resources they need. But even though that was from the 60s, and I think we're all here, we'll go, of course, Theory Y, like companies really don't run that way. Especially the higher up you go in the ladder. the more management becomes protecting against the downside, making sure people aren't making mistakes, making sure people are working hard, assessing how much time and energy people are putting into projects. The other thing to recognize is that we all do our best when we're working on problems that are of interest. And that means that you have to give people the ability to work on problems that are interesting to them. So you need to give them mobility, give them an option to move between projects, give them the flexibility to speak up if they have an idea about something that's different. This is where Google's famous 20% time comes from. Give people a day of the week to work on whatever they think is interesting. And we do that even though conceptually you're losing 20% of people's time, but because we think the outcome, the 10x things that are going to come from that, are going to more than pay for the time and energy. Now, 20% time doesn't work for most companies, but that notion of giving people the option to work on things that are of interest to them, giving people the option to solve problems that fascinate them. Don't create silos, don't discourage movement, don't tell people they can't speak up because someone else in the organization is working on a completely different problem. In order to do that, you have to have transparency. So in order for me to help you, or for me to come up with 10x opportunities throughout the company, I need to know what other problems people are working on. That's where you get more opportunities for 10x. It's also where you get more opportunities for challenging 10% thinking. People can raise their hand and say, you know what, I think we're missing the boat on digital photography. We need to work harder. I have an idea. So default to open, share everything with everyone. Keep as many secrets with the outside world as you need to, but inside your company, inside your teams, people need to know. They need to have true information. Default to open. So this is a product manager group, so most of us don't have anybody that reports to us. We're not the boss. We have influence, but not really a formal authority. So you're probably thinking, I'm not the CEO, probably. So what does this really mean for how I do my job day to day? I want to give you some tools to think about how you can bring 10x thinking to your projects, to your teams, even if that feels limited in scope. First thing is, it's been talked about a lot today, use data to make decisions, not opinions. As Jim Barksdale, who was once the CEO of Netscape, said, if you have facts, let's use them. If all we have are opinions, let's use mine. When you make decisions based on data, you become more a seeker of truth than the seeker of the opinion of the highest paid person in the room. And this is a little bit, it hurts our ego as PMs, right? Because we like to think that we've got these amazing hunches and we just know something's going to work, we know something's not going to work, and that's really what we're there for as the PMs to kind of lead the team. No, get data, test your assumptions. Because the sooner you can test your assumptions and find out if they're working or not working, the sooner you can learn from that. If they're working, do them better. If they're not working, try something else, learn from that. And you can't do that if you can't measure it. Another interesting thing happens when you become very data-driven, and that's that you actually move a lot faster. I mean, I've seen this in project teams. Like, we could argue for the next 3 months about whether the link should be orange or purple, or we can test it and get the answer and move on. Right? Data helps drive decisions. But the other reason it's super important to use data to drive decisions, not opinions, is the #1 killer of 10x thinking at companies is someone saying, that will never work. Right? Digital type, no, that'll never work. Forget it. Pocket veto, throw it away. To be able to test it, to be able to prove it, to be able to return with data and say, it's working. Let's keep doing it. The other thing we need to do is, when we measure the impact we want to have, not the effort. As PMs, we spend a lot of our day focused on measuring effort. How many bugs are in the bug queue? How many are left in the burn down chart? How many engineers are working on this? How many engineers? How long did it take to finish? How many more weeks of effort do we have left? That's measuring effort. That's not measuring impact. When JFK challenged NASA to put a man on the moon, he didn't say, let's launch 15 rockets, stretch goal of 20. He said, land a man on the moon. Let's go. We can measure it. That's the impact we want to have. With 10x, you need to have an emphasis on the impact you want to have. One of the reasons for that is because you don't necessarily know how you're going to get there. If you, as a PM, can lay out all the steps that need to happen between now and when it's done, it's by definition probably not going to be a 10x thing, right? Because we don't know. We have to find out. It sounds like 10%, and that's fine for a lot of projects, but that's not right for 10x. So again, we will accomplish X, not we will do Y. And again, sometimes 10x is easier than 10%. So it turns out you can get to the end result faster than you could have thought otherwise. The other thing I want you to do is be bothered by limitations. So think about how many times we as PMs bump into external limitations. There's not enough memory in the phone for that. It's not fast enough, take too long to download, costs too much. And then we just kind of bump off them like it's a game of bumper cars and we move on. Say nothing you can do about that. And I want to encourage you to not stop when you face an external limitation like that. An example from Google. Even today, I think something like 2/3 of the world's population does not have reliable internet access. You know, we could at Google say, what do you do about that? Hope it gets there. No, we have a project called Loon where we're flying weather balloons to try to bring internet access to the rest of the world. Now, whether or not Loon is going to work or not is kind of irrelevant to the point. The point is, we're not going to back off. We're not going to be bothered by limitations. In the late 1960s, container ships, the container revolution, it pretty much changed world shipping. You load and unload a ship much faster than you could before. The equipment you can use in common. We had faster container ships that get from here to there much faster. But there was a problem, this one shipping company in Hawaii, and that was that by the time the boats got there, they still had to wait several days to get through customs because customs had to go through the shipping manifest. Now, they could have said, what can you do? That's customs. No, a few people had an idea. They said, what if we put the shipping manifest while we're loading the docks in Hawaii on a plane in somebody's suitcase and flew them to San Francisco so we could get a head start? And that was where DHL came from, right? Not giving in to limitations. Amazon. It's hard to remember now, but in the early days of Amazon, they didn't actually have warehouses, right? They had to order books from wholesalers. So I would order a book, Amazon would then order a book from a wholesaler, and then they'd ship it. But most of these wholesalers, they were from kind of the brick and mortar world. So they were assuming these are booksellers that are going to stock shelves. So some of them had, minimum order sizes. Right? Yeah, I got to order 10 books. Now, if Amazon only wanted to sell 10% more books, probably would have been like, what do you do? It's just the way it is. But Amazon didn't want to sell 10% more books. They wanted to sell 10x books. And they found a way around it. One of the Amazon employees discovered that there was a book that was perpetually out of stock on lichens, like mold. I don't think it was because it was a bestseller. I just think it was in their catalog and it was out of stock. So they said, hey, I'm going to try an experiment. Next time a customer orders a book, I'm going to order their book and I'm going to order 9 copies of the lichen book. What'll happen? And what happened is they shipped the book right away and with a little note said, sorry, we're out of the lichen book. And that was how they found their way around those limitations. Jeff Bezos, by the way, says one of these days those lichen books are all going to show up on Amazon's campus. The other thing is bet on trends, right? So trends are really kind of the progress doing the heavy lifting for you. Back to Amazon. Think about Amazon, how big they were in 1995. Think about how big Amazon is in 2015. It's incredible growth. But during that time period, internet users grew 70x, right? So the industry did a lot of hard work for them, right? They strapped themselves to a rocket ship. So think about the trends that you can bet on. Think about the trends that affect your industry. At Google, when we launched Gmail in 2004, if you remember, we promised a gigabyte of free storage. That was huge. It was kind of like effectively unlimited back then, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that was 250 times more than Yahoo Mail offered. And at the time, a gigabyte of storage costs about $1.50, and that doesn't seem like very much. But if you're building a product for hundreds and hundreds of millions of users, it starts to add up. But the team at Gmail, they knew that they were betting on something that was going to happen, and that was that the cost was eventually going to come down, and that by the time all of us, hundreds of millions of us, had gigabytes of email, the cost would come down. And sure enough, It's effectively a penny now. So it's like, again, betting on trends. Sequencing the genome. Right? In 2001, I think it was effectively $100 million to sequence the first genome. Now it costs as much as a chest x-ray. I saw an interview with a researcher where he said, pretty soon it's going to cost as much as flushing the toilet. I was like, I don't know why you pick toilet flushing as your reference point, but I get it. I get it. I don't think about how much the toilet costs when I flush it. Right? So what does that mean for your industry if effectively sequencing a genome becomes free? What does that mean? How do you bet on that? Or let's say you're in the plastics business and you sell essentially a commodity, injection molded plastic. You sell billions of them and you get nice margins. And you get your first demo of a 3D printer. I have a 3D printer at home. Every time I print something, it takes like 3 hours. I have to try it 4 or 5 times before it finally comes out. And it's kind of meh quality. But do you look at that 3D printer and you say, nah, it'll never be good enough. Forget it. Let's sell 10% more injection molded plastic? Or do you bet on a trend? And that trend is that will change. And that actually may create substantial opportunities for your product. There are lots of other trends that have nothing to do with technology, so I don't want this to be about technological trends. Here's an example of some demographic changes. So this is the average age of the world population. So in 2000, it was 26. By 2050, it'll be 36. And you can see in some countries, it's incredible change. China is going from 30 to 50. So the world is getting older. And what does that mean for your business? What does that mean when there's going to be people living longer, people living older? How does that affect you? How do you bet on that trend? The 10x opportunities are there. Here's one example. This is a photograph of the Intergenerational Learning Center in Seattle. It's a preschool inside a nursing home. And it's pretty cool, right? I mean, people are living longer, right? So elderly people, it gives them something to get excited about, a renewed sense of self-worth, because the nursing home isn't just a stopping off point before you die. You might be there for a long time. You're going to live longer. So you want something to enjoy life with. And for children of that age, who are going to be caring for their great-grandparents and their grandparents as people live longer, it helps them teach them more about the aging process. So it's just a kind of a perfect combination. It's just wonderful. And that wasn't any scientist in a lab. That wasn't any technological innovation. That was just somebody who thought about a problem completely different. Put a preschool inside a nursing home. 10x. So, 10x is not thinking outside the box. It's flipping the box around, right? It's turning it over. It's looking at it completely differently. Two of my favorite designers, Charles and Ray Eames. So if you've ever seen the Eames Lounge, mid-century modern designers, amazing designers. They created a documentary in 1977 with IBM. It's called Powers of 10. If you've never seen this, you should definitely watch it. You can find it on YouTube. It's only like 9 minutes long. If you're like me, you'll watch it again and again and again. And what they did is they start with a picnic next to a lake, and they start to zoom the camera back. And every 10 seconds, they zoom the camera back another power of 10. So eventually you see the countryside, and then you can see Lake Michigan, and eventually you can see the entire Earth, our solar system, our galaxy. And then they zoom all the way back in, and they go all the way down to the kind of subatomic level. It's a really great way to kind of get a sense of what it really means, what 10x really means, what powers of 10 really mean. But I'm showing you this for a reason, because I think this movie can give you one tool to take away with that you can think about that'll help you think a little bit more about 10x. The subtitle of this movie is The Effect of Adding Another Zero. And that's what I want you to do, is add another zero. Having a conversation about going 50 miles an hour, how would you go 500 miles an hour? Add more zeros. How do we get to 1 million users? How would we get to 1 billion users? Add zeros to the front. It costs $10 a unit. How would we get the cost down to 1 cent? How would we use 1% the power? And just asking that question causes you to think about the problem in a completely different way. Because the answer to that question isn't, we're going to do what we're doing now, only a little faster, better. No, it can't be. You can't get 1 trillion users of your product doing what you're doing now, right? And the other thing it does is it gives your team, the people you work with, permission to start to think 10x as well. right? It's kind of you're stretching your muscles. Most of the time, the answer is going to be, yeah, it's not possible. We can't do that. But that was a fun exercise. But that exercise is going to help you. That exercise is going to pay off. That exercise is going to force you to think about things in a way that you would not have thought about, particularly when you're really deep in the weeds, when you're a PM and you're shipping a project. You're so deep in the details that it's sometimes very, very hard to step back and say, how do we 10x this? The important thing, as I mentioned before, is to add zeros to the impact, not the effort. So, how do we get to 100 million users? Not, what would we do with 10 times as many engineers? That's effort. What if we shipped 10 months sooner? No. Impact. Focus on impact. Add zeros. So add zeros, right? It's easy. It's pretty simple to just ask that question. What would 10x look like? How would we get there? And not all of us are trying to land on the moon. It's not about moonshots, right? So this doesn't mean we can't use moonshot thinking. Doesn't mean that in your particular project there's not an opportunity to think about something completely different and define 10x. Because again, if you set crazy ambitious goals, even if you miss them, chances are you've accomplished something. You might have accomplished something amazing. By the way, this is a photo of Apollo 11 from 1969, and it's taken on Kodak film, Kodak SO368 Ektachrome film. Kodak was there, right? I mean, every single photo you know of the iconic NASA space programs is taken on Kodak film. But moonshots didn't stop in 1969. This is the very best photo we had of Pluto in 1996. 1996, that wasn't that long ago. It was about 100 pixels wide. That was it. Research papers were written about how much we learned from that stupid little photo, right? It's ridiculous. But this is the very best photo we have of Pluto today. And I say today because NASA released this photo about 3 hours ago. I had an old one in there that was about 100 times less resolution, right? That's how much is changing. Talk about 10x, right? Talk about adding zeros. Like, thanks to the New Horizons program, we've learned so much about Pluto. When we were all kind of watching as those photos came out, I was watching a live stream with NASA. NASA's digital producer was kind of introducing each of the photos. And they showed the one photo where New Horizons is looking back on Pluto. If you've seen this one, it's just kind of a ring. And he said, that was our perfect Kodak moment. Kodak moment. As you know, there's a difference between this photo, this Kodak moment, and the one I showed you from 1969. Kodak had nothing to do with it. It's Kodak's invention, Kodak's patents, but Kodak, they're long gone. 45 years later, the Kodak moment, all we really have left is that term Kodak moment. So what about you? Are you going to be 10x? You're going to be 10%. Thank you.
So what did you think of the talk? Tell me in the comments. Until next time, bye.